Good
Начнем,
afternoon.
как обычно, с вопросов.
Let's start as usual with the
Что вы
questions.
думаете о системе Лазарева?
What do you think about Lazarev's karma diagnostic system?
Ну,
Well,
во-первых, я
first
не
of
так
all,
понимаю
I
карму,
understand
как
karma,
представляет
not the way
ведическая
Vedic
культура.
culture represents it.
Ну, если вкратце,
Well,
то
in short, the
суровая
test in
контрольная в
mathematics in
5
grade
классе
5
по
was hard,
математике это
not
вовсе
at
не
all
потому,
because
что
in
в
grade
первом
1 you were
классе
naughty in the
были
PE
фамильные
class.
уроки физкультуры. Человек
A person in life
решает
solves certain
определенные
tasks.
задачи. Часть из этих
Some of these
задач
tasks are conditioned
обусловлена
not
не
by his
его
past
какой-то
sinfulness,
прошлой
but
греховностью,
by
а
the spiritual
духовным
heritage of
наследием
his
его
ancestral
времени.
line, by
Духовным
the spiritual
наследием
heritage, the
психодинамики
psychodynamics of society in which he was embodied, in the form in which it historically took shape.
исторически сложилось. Поэтому
Therefore,
вопросы
the
диагностики
questions of
кармы
diagnosing
становятся
karma from the
фактически
standpoint of the
заказом
conception of social
выглядят
safety
совсем не так, как
look different
его
from Lazarev's
представляет
standpoint.
Лазарев.
Next
Следующий
question.
вопрос. Есть высказывания,
There are
что
statements
деньги
that
это кровь
money is the
экономики.
blood of the economy,
Государство
and
как
the state is a
единый
single
организм или
organism,
мировая
or the
экономика.
world economy is a single organism.
Ну,
Well,
кровь
blood
не
or
кровь,
not,
поскольку
since,
все-таки
after all, money
денежки
does
не
not participate
участвуют
in the
в
production of
производстве
food products,
продуктов питания,
objects of the
но, скорее
technosphere,
всего,
and
прочего.
everything else.
Денежки только
Money only
сопровождают.
accompanies.
Поэтому деньги
Therefore,
правильнее было бы
it would be more
назвать
correct
тенью
to call
экономики.
money a shadow of the economy.
Ну и то тоже отчасти.
But
Потому
even
что,
then,
с другой
only
стороны,
partly,
деньги
because, on the other hand,
оказывают
money
воздействие
exerts an
на
impact
управление
on the governance towards the microeconomic systems
системами, если
if
люди
people
понимают,
understand
что
that the
кредитно-финансовая
financial
система
credit system as a whole
это не
is not a
собрание
collection
кошельков,
of wallets belonging
принадлежащих
to
разного
various
рода
kinds of
физическим
physical
и
and legal
юридическим
entities,
лицам, а
but an instrument for
управления
governance towards the
макроэкономической
macroeconomic
системой
system
общества.
of society.
Тогда встает
And then the
следующий
following
вопрос.
question arises:
В чьей
who
собственности
owns the
находится
financial credit system
кредитно-финансовая
as an
система как
instrument of
инструмент
governance?
управления? Кто,
Who,
как
how,
и
and
в
in
чьих
whose interests
интересах
governs the
управляет
economy?
экономикой? Можно ли образно
Question:
понимать, если,
is it
допустим,
possible
эти
to understand
сопряжения
imaginarily
кровь
if, for
участвует в
example,
обмене веществ,
these are
то
similar
деньги
phenomena,
товар, деньги
then
товар.
blood is involved in the
Если двойная
metabolism,
мысль дальше
then money
двигается,
is in the
как
exchange
обычно,
of goods,
достаточно
money,
много
goods.
денег, неправильно
Developing the thought further,
олигархов.
where large amounts of money
Во-первых,
accumulate,
это
which
синяки
have fallen
или
into the
метастазы.
hands of oligarchs
В
and the like.
обычном организме
This
много
is
крови
bruises or
обычно
cancer
ничем
metastases.
не очищается. Некие банки, мозг, госпланы,
In an ordinary
сердце,
organism, there is a lot of
постоянный
blood,
приток финансовой
usually in the liver,
артерии.
where it is
Ну, далее
cleansed, some
развивая
banks,
эту
the
аналогию.
brain, some state
Эта
plans,
аналогия
heart,
только
initial
отчасти
flow of funding,
характеризует денежное
arteries, well, and further developing this
Главное,
analogy.
деньги не
Well, in
участвуют
reality, this analogy
в
only
исходном
partly
материале
characterizes money
производства ни
circulation.
продуктов питания, ничего-либо.
In
Поэтому
reality,
деньги это
after all,
просто,
money does
фактически
not
деньги.
participate as raw materials
Да,
in the production
можно
of either
указывать
food
на
or
действия в
anything.
течение
Therefore,
экономических
money is
процессов.
simply an accompanying factor.
Стоит
Yes, money
несколько
exerts an impact on the course of economic processes. Still,
технологических
money is
процессов.
somewhat outside of technological
Есть
processes.
вопрос, мучающий меня с тех пор, как
Question:
познакомилась с
there is a
человеком,
question that has tormented me since I met a person of the Baha'i faith. I have studied this faith, and I am surprised to note how consonant it is with what is stated in the conception of social safety. Why is this faith never mentioned? Only the standard set of 4 basic beliefs is spoken of. And there is a lot of attention to Sai Baba, whose abilities the Hindus themselves question greatly. Meanwhile, the activities of representatives of this faith deserve both attention and study. Why is it not mentioned? Because it appeared relatively recently. But, on the other hand, since that time it came into existence, in fact, it has not offered any scientific methodological support for solving the problems of humanity. Yes, the faith does exist.
Да, есть. Что
As for
касается
Sai
Sai
Baba,
Бабы,
well,
Sai
Sai Baba
Баба,
is gone.
то, что жизнь
The
была
fact is that
его
his life was
не
not the
самая
easiest,
простая, потому что
because the curators
ему
quickly
довольно
directed
быстро
his
взяли
life
в
in a
обработку
necessary way,
и, в
and in
общем-то,
general,
превратили его в
turned him
ловушку.
into an object of
Это
worship.
тоже факт.
This is also a fact,
Этой
and he
ловушки
could not
он
get out of
выйти
this
не смог.
trap.
В конце вы сказали, что
Question.
суперсистема
At the end, you
устойчива,
said
когда
that the
люди
supersystem
едят
is
других
stable
мышей.
when some eat
Как
others,
тогда
about
понимать
mice.
последний фильм
How then
Сергея
should one
Будкова,
understand the
который
last
сильно
film by Sergei
контрастирует,
Budkov,
где
which
он
puts a lot of
показывает,
pressure
что
on the
убивать
psyche,
животных, чтобы
where he
жить,
shows that
не
it's not
надо.
necessary to kill animals
Значит,
in
не
order to
надо
eat?
путать разные вещи.
Do not
Суперсистема –
confuse
это
different things.
абстракция, которая может
A
быть
supersystem
наполнена
is an
разным
abstraction
содержанием
that can be
life.
filled with any
Она
life
может быть
content.
наполнена
It can be
адекватно,
adequately
может
filled,
быть наполнена
or it can be filled with some
какими-то
errors,
ошибками, с
with
какими-то
some
извращениями.
distortions.
Вот когда я
When I
говорил
talked about
об
the Universe
эксперименте
25
Вселенной
experiment,
25, то я
I
говорил о
said
том, что
that
в
in
этом
this experiment,
эксперименте мыши
mice
были
were taken out of the
выведены
impact
из-под
of what
действия
in
того, что
biology
в биологии
is called the
называют
mechanism of natural
механизм
selection.
естественного отбора. В природе
In
механизм
nature, the
естественного
mechanism of
отбора
natural selection is
выражается в
expressed
том,
in the fact
что
that weak defective
слабые
specimens
дефективные
that have lost their life
особи,
potential or
утратившие
dropped it
жизненный
to a certain
потенциал
minimum that does not
или
allow them to interact with the environment,
минимум, который
they are
не позволяет
destroyed.
им взаимодействовать со средой, они уничтожаются.
They are
Уничтожаются
destroyed
либо
in two ways.
они идут на прокорм
They become
другим
food for other biological
биологическим,
species
либо погибают
or
на
die in
победе
intraspecific
природы.
competition. You
Понимаете,
see,
это
this is the
конкретика
concretics of
биологии.
biology. This is
Это
not
не
an abstraction
абстракция,
of the
не
sufficiently
что-то
general
общее
theory of
теории
governance.
управления.
This is not what
Это не
characterizes the
то, что
supersystem as
характеризует
such.
суперсистему как таковую. Это конкретика
This is the
биологии,
concretics of
которая может
biology,
быть
which can be
описана
described
как
as processes
процессы
in
в
a
суперсистемах.
supersystem, but
Опять
again,
же, в их
in their
конкретике.
concretics.
Вот,
Therefore, the
поэтому
question is not about that.
вопрос не о том задан. Как тогда понимать
Question.
последний
How
фильм
then can we
Сергея
understand the
Будкова,
last
где он
film by Sergei
показывает, что
Budkov,
убивать животных
where he
либо
shows that
есть,
it's
либо
not
нет?
necessary to kill animals in order to eat?
Ну, в будущем, по всей видимости,
Well, in
это
the future,
действительно
most
будет
likely,
потребно, потому
this really will be unnecessary,
вместе с
because together
плотью
with the flesh,
мы
we absorb that
превращаем
information of fear and horror
ужаса,
that
который
precedes the murder.
предшествует убийству, и как мы
And how we
перевариваем
digest and
эту
transform this
трансформированную
information and
информацию
into
во
what?
что,
This is an
это
open
вопрос
question. But again, as I said last
в
time,
прошлый раз. В
in
исторически
historically taken
сложившихся
shape
культурах,
cultures,
при том
at the
уровне
level of
развития,
development that we have
который
reached,
мы достигли, в общем,
many are not
очень
able
многие
to
не в
give up flesh
состоянии
eating,
отказаться от плотиедения. Не
not
потому,
because
что
they
они
don't
хотят,
want
а
to,
потому что
but
организм
because
не
the
позволяет.
organism will not allow it.
Но это не значит, что
But this does not mean that
человечество
humanity should be in the state in which it
состоянии, в
is,
котором пребывает,
since the further reproduction of this quality of life is suicidal for the global civilization for various reasons.
по разным причинам. Причины
The reasons are discussed in the 6th volume of Fundamentals of Sociology in the conclusion.
Можно ли
Question.
считать любовь
Can love
процессом?
be considered a
Жизнь
process?
все является
Everything in life
процессом.
is a process.
Если да, то можно ли
Question.
вывести
If so,
модель любви?
is it possible to make a model of
Вывести
love?
модель любви
It
нельзя,
is impossible to make a model of love because love is always concrete in her manifestations.
творческий
In
потенциал
it,
человека.
the creative potential of man is realized precisely in the concretics of
Чем
circumstances.
является с позиции
Question.
триединства душа, добро и любовь?
What are soul, dobro, and love
Писал
from the
Чучев,
standpoint of the triunity?
в этом мире она
The soul, as Chuchev wrote, is a dweller of two worlds.
частью этого мира,
In this world, she is only present, not being a part of it.
себя две компоненты.
Part of this world is the human organism, which includes two components.
Вторая
The first component is the material body. The second component is a biofield component, which is represented by a macrobiofield, which is called the aura, and microbiofields of cells and cell elements. And this is what concerns the soul.
касается души.
Dobro,
Добро, ну, в концепции
in the conception of social safety, dobro in the life of human society means everything that contributes to development, and evil,
это все то, что
this is
направлено
everything that is aimed at
консервации
preserving the errors of past eras
прошлых
and at man's degradation as a personality,
человека как личности,
that is, in the aspect of the psyche and as a biological object.
человеческого.
This is evil.
Это зло. Ну а любовь
Well,
это
love is creativity aimed at development.
развитие в конечном итоге любовь не имеет
Ultimately, love, having no formal juridical or any logical definitions, if she is there, it is feelable.
если нет.
If not, it is also feelable.
Главное
But the main thing is that love is always concrete and never abstract.
как в жизни
Question.
может выглядеть процесс
What can the
автосинхронизации
autosynchronization process look like in real life on high priorities?
массовый демонизм
So far, we have, as it seems to me, mass demonism and portraying oneself as a
процессе
human.
автосинхронизации мы
We will consider the processes of autosynchronization in one of the following
как в
lectures.
жизни он выглядит на
What does it look
более
like in life on higher priorities?
Понимаете, если говорить о
You see,
процессе
if we talk about the autosynchronization process, then it's required that the elements of the system have the corresponding informational algorithmic support.
если это
If this informational algorithmic support is present, then it's possible to organize the process of autosynchronization, when the elements are transferred to governance in accordance with this informational algorithmic support. If this informational algorithmic support is not present, then it is impossible to start the autosynchronization process on this basis. Everything will be according to the well-known anecdote about a telepath. A man walks around a city with his friend and says to him, "I'm a telepath. Prove it. Do you want, over there on the balcony, a man to appear naked and throw down his television?" "Yeah, okay." Some time passes, the man does not throw his television. The telepath tenses himself once more. A naked man appears on the balcony and screams in a moaning way, "Well, I don't have a television." You see, this anecdote, it is actually partly funny, partly works, but it indicates, in fact, the right circumstances that in order to do something, all the necessary resources are needed that this thing requires. And if on high priorities now there is no information and algorithmics that allow one to start the autosynchronization process, then this means that one just needs to create this informational algorithmic support, distribute information, help people develop, so that when there is a sufficient number of carriers of this information, the autosynchronization process could be launched and thereby change the quality of life of society. At this point, we finish the questions, and now we will move on to the sufficiently general theory of governance, to the thematics of this lecture. Last time we looked into the text of section 13.1. of the preliminary materials of the training course, The Sufficiently General Theory of Governance. For now, let's turn to section 13.2, Mastering the Potential of Development. One more time. A supersystem is an abstraction in the sufficiently general theory of governance. This abstraction is needed so that, filling it with real-life content, it would be possible to describe, model certain processes, and organize processes of governance in cases where the traditional views on governance, formed on the basis of other theories of governance, turn out to be functionally inoperable. But if we consider a supersystem that is introduced into a certain environment, for the sake of some objectives, immediately after the beginning of the processes of its adaptation to the environment, and the beginning of the mastery of the potential of development, then the first question is, what kind of environment can it be? The environment in this context is the processes with which the supersystem deals, which impacts it, and on which it itself exerts an impact. All processes are the triunity of matter, information, measure, that is, algorithmics. But when we formulate a task of governance, we are usually not interested in the whole triunity as such, but in some aspects. Either the material aspect, or informational, or algorithmic aspect. And accordingly, in the concretics of the solution or formulation of the task, on the basis of abstractions connected with supersystems, the environment can appear before us in any of its qualities, either as a material environment, or as an informational algorithmic environment, or in both qualities. But when it comes to concretics, you should always be aware of what you really want, and in what aspects you are interested in the environment. Because if you are interested in material aspects, then you can't get away from it. You need a certain matter, in a certain amount, in a certain state of aggregation. If you are interested in informational algorithmic aspects, then the question of the material carrier of these processes may not be so relevant anymore, and there may be some variability in the selection and construction of the material carrier of those processes that are of interest to you. Accordingly, two types of isolation are possible for this approach, that is, singling out of a supersystem in the environment, either in the material aspect or in the informational algorithmic aspect. And in this case, although I am talking about the triunity, I still do not divide the informational algorithmic aspect into information and algorithmics. Because information in our life is never without coding systems and algorithmics for its processing. Another thing is that the variability of algorithmics and coding systems can also arise at certain stages of modeling real processes on the basis of the conceptual apparatus of the theory of supersystems. If we talk about the localization of supersystems, then in the triunity, spatial localization is possible. Moreover, in this case, space should be understood precisely as an informational metric characteristic of the triunity in certain aspects. Here, again, the question arises that if we are talking about space, then even abstract spaces always have an origin, that is, some point from which you look at the whole space. This also concerns all applied aspects. Because if you argue about which system is correct, geocentric or heliocentric, well, this debate is pointless. Because from the point of view of theoretical mechanics, you can make observations, make calculations in both the geocentric and heliocentric systems. The only question is, do you know the rules of transition from one system to another? But, in principle, nothing prevents you from moving to some third system, which will be broader and will give a different idea of the processes that you can observe in both systems. Therefore, the question of the spatial localization of supersystems should always be connected with the solution of concrete tasks, what you want to get. Because if, for example, you are solving navigation tasks on planet Earth, then it's better for you to use the geocentric coordinate system, but not the heliocentric one. But if you are engaged in navigational tasks in the aspect of space flights, then most likely the heliocentric system will be more convenient in this case. And when you go beyond the solar system, to all appearances, you will need some other system, most likely connected with the center of the galaxy to begin with, and further on, you might need something else. But in any case, if there is a supersystem, then there is an informational localization. This means that characteristics of informational objects, that is, informational modules that are characteristic of certain elements of the supersystem and which distinguish it from other supersystems and from the environment. The question of informational localization is, in fact, simple, because it is a question of where and how certain informational modules are distributed, because the content does not change, because something can be placed in the preface of the book, something can be placed as conclusions at the end of the book, but contently it will be one and the same information. And further, everything is according to Shukshin. Either you have read a lot of prefaces, or you have read a lot of conclusions. But when we perceive information, we perceive it differently. According to how our psyche is arranged, and in general, it often happens in such a way that some questions are easier for us to understand if we go from the general to the particular, and other questions we are not able to understand general objective laws until we see some particular manifestation of them. But the essence in the end does not change because of this. What else do you need to understand? Even if we have singled out a supersystem in the environment according to its characteristic features, then we must understand that for the components of the system of elements, the rest of the supersystem is part of the external environment. And although all the elements are to some extent autonomous in terms of material support, energy supply, informational algorithmic support of their activities, thanks to this, the supersystem as a whole is also to some extent autonomous in this sense. But in relation to the environment, it may not be closed. That is, it can maintain its existence on account of the resources of the environment, or it can be closed in this sense. That is, exchange with the environment may be absent. But in the sense that the material carriers of the elements of the supersystem and the supersystem as a whole, in the process of development, in the process of degradation, do not cease to be elements of the supersystem, but still belong to it. Well, of course, if the system is not closed in relation to the environment, then the exchange can be mutually directed. Now let's turn to the informational algorithmic support of self-governance of the elements of the supersystem, into which the potential of development is embedded. If there is potential of development, then this means that there is some non-determination in the aspect of realizing the potential of development. Because the potential of development can be realized, mastered, in different ways, and the variativeness of paths is always initially some kind of non-determination. Further, everything depends on the concretics of the circumstances, the pressure of the environment on the supersystem, which will compel to some variants of development and block others, and governance from the part of the conjugated intellect of the supersystem and its separate elements, which, for various reasons, will give preference to some variants of development, refusing other variants of development. This means that informational algorithmic support should include two components: a fundamental part, which can be more or less identical for all elements of the supersystem. Its task is to guarantee the interaction of every element and the supersystem as a whole with the environment at the minimum level of development. If this is not ensured, then the supersystem, even if it's introduced into the environment, will be destroyed by the environment or pushed out of it. That is, the purpose of the fundamental part is to provide a starting, basic level of interaction of the supersystem as a whole and its elements with the environment. The second part of the informational algorithmic support is the adaptational part. The adaptational part, it is variative, and by strength of the variativeness in relation to the supersystem, it is described by some statistics of the distribution of the elements in the supersystem according to the set of characteristic parameters with which you intend to describe this adaptational part.
Вот. Кроме того, может быть и иерархия. Иерархия может быть связана с тем,
This
что
adaptational part can develop in every element in a peculiar way on the basis of the fundamental part of informational algorithmic support in the process of interaction of an element of the supersystem with the supersystem itself and the environment that encompasses the supersystem.
втором и последующем приоритетах могут быть какие-то другие задачи.
The fundamental part may have its own hierarchical inordering of informational algorithmic modules, which is necessary to ensure some initial specialization of elements, as is the case in all biological species in which there is a sexual division of specimens.
То в этом случае все остальные
There
задачи
is a fundamental part of informational algorithmic support. It is adapted in each sex to solve the entrusted to it tasks.
следующие задачи. Конкретные
But along with this, there is something
если
common
обратить
that unites the elements of the supersystem into the supersystem.
получилось так, что
Also, there may be a hierarchy.
основным кораблей стала авиация. И вследствие этого
The hierarchy can be connected with the fact that the vector of objectives is hierarchically ordered,
они успешно решают задачи ПВО.
and the hierarchy of the vector of objectives connected with the fundamental part is such that the first priority will always be the survival of the elements of the supersystem and the supersystem as a whole,
Кто конкретно и как,
and only on the second and subsequent priorities can there be some other tasks and the corresponding informational algorithmic support.
решал те задачи, которые были актуальны.
Why so? Simply because if the task of survivability, stable interaction with the supersystem of every element and the supersystem as a whole is not ensured, then in this case all other tasks can also not be solved,
Не имеет
because only a successful solution to the task of survivability enables the solution of all subsequent tasks.
также и в других сферах деятельности.
Concrete examples of this.
Примеры, как
If we turn to the history of World War II,
объекты или
it turned out that aviation became the main means of destroying ships,
ментальные части,
and as a consequence of this circumstance, ships of all classes
они связаны
could be consistent only if they successfully solved the task of air
Информационная
defense.
часть информационного
If the tasks of air defense were not solved,
она
then in this case the ships could not solve the tasks for which they were built.
во всех процессах она должна опираться
Again, if we talk about who exactly and how,
времени, пока
then perhaps the Americans in this matter created in terms of composition the most correct navy, which solved those tasks that were relevant during the Second World War.
некое новое качество, в котором
The navies of all other powers, for some reason, did not understand this task, and many ships were destroyed by aviation simply because they did not have the proper air defense weapons. Exactly the same is also in other spheres of activity.
вопросами развития. Вопросы развития – это всегда вопросы интеллекта.
You can find examples when some objects or objects that are elements of supersystems, even at the level of the fundamental part of the information support of their functioning, are connected with a certain hierarchy of objectives.
Для многих безальтернативно, что человек
The adaptational part of the informational algorithmic support is variative,
что вот он такой умный,
but normally, in all processes, it should rely on the fundamental part, at least until the element or the supersystem as a whole has developed some informational algorithmic support of the next level, which will bring them to a new quality in which everything concerning the fundamental part ceases to be relevant. But this theme is connected with questions of development.
характеризуются как облакогонители, то это следствие того, что
Questions of development are always questions of intellect. Intellect localized either within the boundaries of the supersystem or intellect conjugated with the supersystem. And here, in general, it is necessary to abandon the opinion, which is practically alternativeless for many, that man is the only unique reason-carrying being, that he is so smart and alone in the universe. Because if we turn to the history of science, to the history of life, then in general, history preserves the memory of those times when man communicated with non-social intellects. Because when in the dictionary of V.I. Dahl, the magi are characterized as cloud dispersers, this is a consequence of the fact that in some way the magi came to an agreement with the elements of nature, and such stories are captured in epics, in tales. It is just that for us these are groundless inventions, but for the ancient people it was the practice of life, which, perhaps, was not available to everyone, because such practice requires a certain personal development, first of all, nravi is ethical, because ethics is a regulator of interrelationships of carriers of reason. And if your ethics is such that you, besides your beloved self, cannot communicate with anyone else for the simple reason that all other reason carriers ignore and distance themselves from you, or try to push you somewhere so that you do not interfere with them, then to talk about the fact that the universe is reasoning for you is useless. Nevertheless, this ancient pagan self-evidence, over the course of a long time, rejected and condemned both by the ruling churches and by science divorced from religion, has been forming this mentality of many people in many generations. So this view has become traditional, dominant. But, as the proverb says, push nature through the door, she will enter through the window. Therefore, if people encounter certain events in life, they somehow have to meaningfully comprehend them, and at a certain stage, science, represented by V.I. Vernadsky and Teilhard de Chardin, put forward the conception of the noosphere, the conception of reason of the planet, in which the intellect of every person is only a component of the collective intellect. Even during the reign of materialistic atheism, academician N.M. Amosov, an outstanding surgeon, cybernetician, in his book Algorithms of Reason, wrote about intellect precisely as a pan-natural phenomenon, the objective laws of which are the same both for people and for the collective intellect of society, the intellect of animals, and other intellects that can be detected in creation. Therefore, the question about development is always a question about intellect. Connected with the supersystem, or external in relation to its intellect, or internal intellect, which can be localized either in the supersystem as a whole, on the basis of intellectless elements, or on the basis of intellectually armed elements, every one of which possesses individual intellect, and, in the aggregate, can generate collective intellects. This circumstance, it is alternativeless for understanding what is called the theory of supersystems in the sufficiently general theory of governance.
границу между ними, открывает широчайшие
If you
ворота
insist that intellect is purely human,
и в этом
specific and characteristic
опасность,
only to
а с
man,
другой стороны,
then everything else does not have to be read or listened to until you change your mind on this question.
потому что развитие и деградация
Further,
объективно
I have
различны,
said in other lectures that the main problem of liberalism consists in the fact that it does not see and does not want to see the difference between development and degradation.
то мы всегда должны понимать, что
For liberalism, everything is limitless diversity, which is worthy of protection and which must be guarded, cared for, and cherished.
потенциал развития, он ориентирован
But with its unwillingness to deal with the question of the difference between development and degradation, liberalism erases the border between them,
системы
opens the widest gates for degradational processes, and, in this aspect, it poses a danger,
уровень
and on the other hand, it is one of the expressions of idiocy,
она введена. Так, чтобы
because development and degradation
реализовывались по максимуму
are objectively different in every concrete case in relation to any object,
в виде, как их
in relation to any supersystem.
суперсистему интеллект. Если
Therefore,
интеллект
when we talk about the potential of development, then we must always understand
возможно создать
that there are differences between degradation and potential of development.
вопрос о диалоговых взаимоотношениях интеллекта
The potential of development is oriented towards realizing certain ideals, achieving certain objectives,
высшим
and in relation to the processes of the supersystem, the supersystem must reach a certain level of development set for it by its creator, and interaction with the environment into which it is introduced in such a way that the objectives of the interaction of this supersystem with the environment will be realized to the maximum in the form set by the intellect creating this supersystem.
религия, вероучение – это бредни.
If the conjugated intellect of the supersystem is not the intellect that created it,
Управление, она
but some other intellect, possibly created by the creator of the supersystem, then there arises the question
свои личностные
concerning the dialogical interrelationship of the intellects localized in the supersystem or conjugated with it, with the hierarchically higher governance, up to the highest, all-encompassing governance, which is also intellectual.
Но, тем не менее, вопрос о бытии Бога
This is already going beyond the boundaries of what V.I. Vernadsky and Teilhard de Chardin called the noosphere. This is an entrance to the level of the universal reason,
жизни каждого человека есть нечто
and an entrance to the level where communication with the creator of the universe, the Almighty, is possible.
состояние проникнуть экстрасенса, но Бог
But again, from the point of view of many, religion, creed, this is the nonsense of people that do not know physics.
в соответствии
The logic of the sufficiently general theory of governance is such that if people adhere to atheistic convictions, do not consider it necessary to build their personal relationships with the Creator, Almighty,
не позволяет
then the sufficiently general theory of governance is not for them.
бытия Бога на основании того, что их молитвы
They,
ответили в соответствии
being in this prejudice, will never be able to master the potential of this instrumentarium.
понять, почему
But, nevertheless, the question of the existence of God, Creator and Almighty,
Но
is natural.
если человек в состоянии
But the answer to it again carries a Nravius ethical character,
диалога со Всевышним,
because in the life of every person there is something innermost, which only he knows about, and no one knows about it among his friends, relatives.
что имели место
ESP adepts are not able to penetrate this innermost, but God knows.
в упоении,
And if the dialogue is built on the basis of the innermost,
хлебать плоды
then
своей
life
ошибки.
goes on in accordance with the meaning of the prayers that touch this innermost. And in this ethical, in essence, proof, also consists the proof of God. But prejudices in some case do not allow many people to recognize the fact of the being of God on the basis that their prayer was answered in accordance with its meaning, through the flow of life circumstances, or somehow it was made clear why the request was inappropriate and remained unfulfilled. But if a person is able to meaningfully comprehend what happened as a result of a dialogue with the Almighty, further possibilities open up for him. If he refuses to recognize this fact as such, and insists that meaningless, random coincidences occurred, he is doomed to remain enraptured with his intellectual power and reap the fruits of his mistakes in life, in some cases creating problems, not only for himself, but also for others and for descendants. Therefore, the question of development and degradation is key for understanding the processes in supersystems, precisely in the aspect of mastering the potential of development. Because if the potential of development for you is not determined, if you do not see a certain border between development and degradation, then you cannot develop in a meaningful way. Maybe, under the kick of the impact of life circumstances, you will anyway reach the level when you begin to develop meaningfully by volitional order. But it is not excluded that if you persist, then life circumstances will harm you. If you do not delve into the concretics of examples of degradation and development, then degradation is expressed in the fact that an object ceases to exist much earlier than it exhausts its functional resource. Development is expressed in the fact that the object completely goes through the life cycle genetically programmed for it. Or, before the end of this cycle, it reaches a certain new quality, for the sake of which, in fact, the development was started. Or it reaches this new quality at the end of the life cycle. You see, such a definition of development and degradation, it is in many respects abstract, but nevertheless, brains and intellectual power are given in order to correlate abstractions with the concretics of life, and correlate the concretics of life with abstractions. Therefore, I will not give examples. An example of degradation is the entire Western civilization. The problems of Russia are running in place, jumping from degradation to development, and vice versa, instead of taking a general course of development and following it. Further, there arises the question about the reactions of the supersystem and their elements to the impact of the environment.
вероятностно-статистически
The reaction
предопределенная
can be
реакция
unambiguously determined,
неоднозначна. Во
deterministic,
множествах
that
обычно
is,
кто-то
to the
реагирует
question 2
ошибочно,
times 2,
кто-то
how
реагирует
much,
правильно,
the answer is 4.
стандартным образом, кто-то реагирует творчески. Это
The
все
answer is
имеет
always
место быть
correct
в
and
процессных
unambiguous.
суперсистемах. Поэтому характер взаимодействия
But there are many elements in the supersystem.
элементов друг с
There are
другом
also many
среды,
processes outside the
суперсистемах,
supersystem,
в общем,
and the
универсальных
reaction to the
различий
impact of the
предопределенного
environment,
характера.
to the
И в
impact
этой
of other elements of
неоднозначности
the
может
supersystem,
выражаться как
can
развитие,
in
так
some
и
cases be
деградация.
variative.
Ну и,
That is,
соответственно,
not
суперсистема
unambiguously
обладает
predetermined,
памятью.
but variatively
Память эта
predetermined.
может быть локализована по-разному, потому что если говорить о
And variative
человеческой
predetermination
информационной
is always
системе,
certain
то
statistical
часть памяти это
predeterminations
наша
and the
историческая память, а
probabilities of
часть
going
памяти
beyond the
это
norms of
память ноосферы.
statistics on the basis of some
Разряд
creative
между
act,
исторической
that is,
наукой и
the
памятью
expression
ноосферы, он
of
в
intellectual
ряде
activity.
случаев играет далеко не последнюю роль в жизни
All this has an
суперсистемы,
action in
если
all these
человечество
supersystems,
рассматривать как
and
суперсистему.
if the informational
Обратите
algorithmic
внимание,
support is
все мы в детстве
defective,
читали
then
Дюма
a
«Третьих героев»
deterministic,
и научили
predetermined
его.
reaction can be
Мы
erroneous and
знаем,
murderous.
когда выросли, что изучать
If
историю
the
Франции
probabilistically,
эпохи
statistically
Дюма, это,
predetermined
мягко
reaction
говоря, не
is
смотреть то, что
ambiguous,
надо.
then in pluralities,
Ведь есть
some usually
исторические
react
романы и об
erroneously,
истории России.
some react correctly in
Есть
a standard
повесть
way,
Алексея Константиновича
some
Толстого
react
«Россия»
creatively.
о временах Ивана
This
Грозного.
all takes place in processes in
Мы все ее
supersystems.
читали, но те, кто читал, в большинстве своем не восприняли ее как литературу.
Therefore, the character of the interaction of elements with each other and with the environment in supersystems, in fact, does not carry an unambiguously predetermined character, and in this non-univocality, both development and degradation can be expressed. Well, and accordingly, the supersystem has memory. This memory can be localized in different ways, because if we talk about humanity as a supersystem, then part of the memory is our historical science, and part of the memory is the memory of the noosphere. And the discord between historical science and the memory of the noosphere, in some cases, plays far from the last role in the life of the supersystem, if we consider humanity as a supersystem.
Нравов и этики, которые действительно имели место в ту эпоху, которую Дюма так или иначе описал. Для нас это просто
Pay
интересно, но
attention.
это не вызывает
We all in
раздражения,
childhood
потому
read
что это не
A.
наша
Dumas,
история,
The Three Musketeers,
не мы,
and a lot of other things.
не наши
We know when we
предки
grew up
с этим
that
были
studying the
связаны.
history of France from the works of A. Dumas
Память ноосферы в
is,
данном
to put it
вопросе,
mildly,
она
somewhat
обладает
not what we
более высокой
need.
значимостью,
But there are
чем
also historical
наша
novels
личность.
about the history of Russia.
Хотя память ноосферы мы далеко не всегда в состоянии осознать во всей
There is a
детальности,
novel by
как
Alexei
того,
Konstantinovich Tolstoy, The Prince of Silver, about the
В
times
общем,
of Ivan the
память,
Terrible.
она дана для того,
Not
чтобы
everyone read it,
сопряженные
but those who
интеллектом,
read it, for the most part, did not
анализируя
perceive it
прошлое
as a
и
literary
прошлые
masterpiece.
результаты,
Why?
делал выводы, выявлял ошибочные
Because this
реакции,
story
вырабатывал новые
expresses an elite
реакции
point of
на
view
явления,
on the era of Ivan the Terrible,
связанных со взаимодействием суперсистемы
and
с
the elite point of view on the era of Ivan the
Причем, если
Terrible,
говорить
to put it
о
mildly, does not
нашем
correspond
обществе, о
to what was
человечестве в
really in
целом,
history in that era.
в аспекте переосмысления прошлого, то дело
But
обстоит
since we are
наоборот,
all unconsciously,
потому что
one way or the other,
Ключевский прав,
enclosed on, connected to,
история
the segment of the noosphere of Russian
закономерность
civilization,
исторических явлений
the
обратно
noospheric
пропорциональна
reaction to our reading of The Prince of Silver
Если вы
is exactly like
посмотрите
that. Don't care a fig
нашу
and forget
историю
it.
в том виде, в каком она даже известна по произведениям ученых
But
историков.
reading the history of France in the version of A. Dumas, it is simply entertaining reading on the one hand, and on the other hand, these are some examples of nravs and ethics that really took place in that era, and which A. Dumas, one way or the other, described.
Появляется элита, которой общенародная государственность не нужна.
For us, this is simply interesting, but it does not cause rejection, because this is not our history, not us, not our ancestors are connected with this matter. But the memory of the noosphere in this question has a higher significance than what our historians write, although we are far from always able to meaningfully comprehend the memory of the noosphere in all detailedness and factology of what happened in the past. So memory is given so that the conjugated intellect, analyzing the past and past results, draws conclusions, identifies erroneous reactions, works out new reactions to the solution of those tasks that are connected with the interaction of the supersystem with the environment. Moreover, if we talk about our society, about humanity as a whole, in the aspect of changing views on the past, then the situation is extremely bad. Because V.O. Kluchevsky is right. The regularity of historical phenomena is inversely proportional to their spirituality. And if you look at our history in the form in which it is, even known from the works of scholarly historians, then the cyclics of Russia is unchanging. After a catastrophe, an attempt to build an all-people statehood, the first phase of the cycle completes with the emergence of an elite that does not need an all-people statehood. A coup d'etat takes place, resulting in the emergence of an elite corporate state. The elite corporate state is drawn into the process of degradation and leads the country to a new catastrophe. Still, you see, if people have reason and are strong-willed, then there is no need to step on one and the same rake another time. It is necessary to manifest creativity and work out methods for solving social problems, and not only social problems of Russia, which would make it possible to reach a new quality of development, bypassing the next catastrophe generated by the post-Soviet corporative elite statehood. Therefore, the question of the attitude to memory is also far from the last question in the mastery of the potential of development of the supersystem. Further, another theme arises. If the supersystem interacts with the environment, then there arises the question about the frequency range that is achievable for it in the mode of interaction with the environment as a whole. That is, it is a question of the long-range action and the performance speed of the means of exchange of information between the elements of the supersystem. Why is this so? Because any governorial reaction must be timely, in the sense that it must fit into the window of possibilities. And if the information from one end of the supersystem to the other end of the supersystem reaches some finite time, and the process of governance must fit exactly into this finite time in order to be effective, then If within this finite time, the information does not manage to reach a periphery of the supersystem, then it cannot react in a timely manner to the impact of the environment. Well, there is such a historical anecdote that information about Napoleon's attack on Russia came to Kamchatka after the Russian army entered Paris. This is precisely about the fact that the performance speed of information exchange channels, their long-range action, they condition the possibility or impossibility of the reaction of the supersystem as a whole to some processes. But if the supersystem spreads in the environment and goes beyond these boundaries, which are conditioned by the long-range action of information exchange channels and their performance speed, then the supersystem cannot exist as a whole, at least in relation to the solution of at least some tasks. And this leads to the fact that there is a division of the supersystem as a whole into several nested supersystems. At first, this separation can allow their interaction with each other at intervals of time sufficient for the information exchange between the extreme, most distant in terms of information exchange, points of the supersystem to proceed, and in some questions that require performance speed, the supersystem cannot already exist as a whole. And in this case, there are two variants. Either the distant fragments of the supersystem begin to self-govern themselves, reacting to the impacts of the environment, or, while awaiting guidance from the rest of the supersystem, they will be suppressed by the environment up to their complete destruction. But if the process of self-governance of the distant fragments of the supersystem begins, then it also occurs on the paths of mastering the creative potential. And since the mastery of the potential of development carries a variative character, then there can arise information coding systems, algorithmics of information processing, that will divide different fragments of the supersystem, making their interaction at these levels simply impossible. Because, in order for the interaction of the elements of the supersystem as a whole to be possible, it is required that all its fragments have identical information coding systems, which allows information exchange. If this is not the case, then there is something that many have come across on the internet. You download a file, but you cannot open it because the corresponding software is not installed on your computer. And in questions of the development of the supersystem, everything flows in exactly the same way. That is, if the supersystem spreads in the environment, and the performance speed and the long-range action of the information exchange channels between its elements is insufficient to cover the entire supersystem, then the supersystem splits into a certain number of fragments, and each of these fragments masters the potential of development on its own, independently of other elements, other fragments of the supersystem. And, as a result, in the supersystem as a whole, there arise competing processes that are aimed at mastering the potential of development or not mastering the potential of development, but restoring the
то
unity of
функция
governance towards
управления
the supersystem as a
в
whole.
данном случае должна быть единой для, опять же, всех элементов
Here it is
этого
necessary
системного
to
цикла.
understand such a thing, that if the
Но
performance speed of
если
the information exchange channels and their
есть
long-range action
какие-то
is
фрагменты
limited,
суперсистемы,
then
которые
the
имеют
restoration of the
ступень
integrity of the
самостоятельного
governance towards the
развития,
supersystem as a whole,
то
the
в
unity of
реализации
governance,
в них полной
it is
функции
possible only on
управления
account of
может
reducing
отличаться от
the
того,
performance
как
speed of the
это дело
supersystem
представляет тот
and,
интеллект, который
accordingly,
претендует на
reducing the performance speed
восстановление
of the supersystem.
управления
This
суперсистемой
entails the slowing
единицей.
of processes of development.
И здесь тогда встает вопрос о том, что будет дальше, потому что с точки
This circumstance
зрения
leads to
тех
the fact
интеллектов,
that it is
которые
necessary to
претендуют
turn
на
again to the
восстановление
question of the
управления
entire function of
суперсистемой в
governance,
целом, вопрос о
because
развитии он уже
if it's a question
перестает
of
быть
restoring
актуальным, потому
governance
что
towards the
первым
supersystem as a
приоритетом для них
whole,
именно
then
задача
someone must carry the
восстановления
entire
целостности
function of governance
суперсистемы как
towards
объекта
this
управления.
particular supersystem
И,
as a whole.
соответственно, то, что происходит
The
в
entire
отдельных
function of governance
суперсистемах,
in the given
которые
case
так или иначе
should be the
обладают
same,
некой автономией
again, for all
в
elements
аспекте
of the
управления,
supersystem as a whole.
для них
But if there
представляется
are
как
some
ошибка
fragments of the
управления,
supersystem
как помеха
that have
в
already
управлении.
embarked on an
И,
independent path of
соответственно,
development,
встает вопрос о нейтрализации, о подавлении управления по полной функции в тех
then
или
the
иных
implementation of the
суперсистемах,
entire
которые
function of
будут
governance in
контролировать
them may differ
тому
from
центру
how this thing is
управления, который
represented by
претендует
the
на
intellect that claims to
восстановление
restore governance
управления
towards the supersystem as a whole.
в целом.
And here there arises the question of what will happen next.
Ну вот слов получилось много, но суть проста. Если кто-то претендует на всевластие,
Because from the point of view of those intellects with aspirations of restoring governance towards the supersystem as a whole, the question of development is no longer relevant, because the first priority for them is the task of restoring the integrity of the supersystem as an object of governance. What is happening in the regions of the supersystem, which in one way or the other have acquired some kind of autonomy in the aspect of governance, seems to them as an error of governance, as a hindrance to their governance, and accordingly, there arises the question of neutralization, of suppression of governance according to the entire function in those regions of the supersystem that are not under the control of the center of governance, with claims to restoring governance towards the supersystem as a whole.
разного рода деградационных процессов в той же самой суперсистеме. И, соответственно, если это
Well, here there are a lot
противоречит
of words, but the essence is
первому
simple.
приоритету в векторе целей
If someone has pretensions to omnipotence within the boundaries of the supersystem, then he does not need competitors, because from his point of view, competitors are always mistaken.
пока тем или иным способом иерархически
Further, the question arises, how does such a position correlate with the hierarchically highest, all-encompassing governance?
Как его можно пресечь? Можно
You see, if for the hierarchically highest, all-encompassing governance, the task of mastering the potential of development of the supersystem is significant, then this is already a conflict.
Некоторые источники настаивают на том, что катастрофа
Because the restoration of integrity, on account of suppression of processes of development, this is the conservation of various kinds of underdevelopedness and the possibility of stimulating various kinds of processes of degradation in the same supersystem.
они все-таки придерживаются того,
And accordingly, if this contradicts the first priority in the vector of objectives of the creators of the supersystem, then such a mode of functioning can exist only within the boundaries of allowance, until in one way or the other, the hierarchically
Другой
higher,
вариант.
encompassing governance, considers it necessary to cease this
Поскольку
process.
суперсистема распалась на автономные регионы, изолированные друг от друга, если не в
How
аспекте
can it be
индивидуального
ceased?
взаимодействия,
By
а в
eliminating
аспекте
all the memory of the supersystem
информационно-алгоритмического обмена,
and resuming the
может
process of
продолжать
development
процесс
from scratch. Well, some sources insist that the
самоуправления
catastrophe of
автономных регионов,
Atlantis
которые
was
направлены на
accompanied by the
освоение
fact
потенциала развития.
that the overwhelming majority lost their memory,
Соответственно, там тоже
and
будет
those who retained the memory were
реализовываться
forced to
полная
start
функция управления
restoring
в
governance.
отношении каждого из этих регионов, и в этом случае конкурирование
But, judging by what has taken place in the history of the last 13,000 years, they still adhere to that mode of governance when the restoration of the integrity of humanity as a supersystem they carry out at the expense of hindering the mastery of the potential of development. That is, they lead everything to the situation where the same rake will be stepped on again.
Но здесь может возникнуть вопрос, почему
Another
управление
variant.
носит непосредственного
Since the
характера со
supersystem
стороны
has disintegrated
государства,
into autonomous regions,
но не
divorced
носит
from each other, if not in the aspect of
непосредственного
material interaction,
мирозданий. Это не только
then in the aspect of
суперсистемы,
informational
которые мы
algorithmic
рассматриваем,
exchange,
это и другие
it is
суперсистемы.
possible to support the processes of self-governance in autonomous regions which are aimed at mastering the potential of development.
К этому самоуправлению может добавляться
Accordingly, the entire function of governance will also be implemented there in relation to each of these regions, and, in this case, the competition of processes of governance in different regions of the supersystem will lead to the fact that each of the regions will be a catalyst, stimulus, external impact, exposing errors in the governance of all the other regions, and flowing under the control of the hierarchically highest all-encompassing governance.
Хотя, безусловно, есть и объективные основы для разграничения мироздания на те или иные объекты.
But here the question may arise, why is governance not of a direct character on the part of the hierarchically higher governance? Well, it is not of a direct character because creation is not only the supersystem that we are considering, it is also other supersystems, and almightiness is expressed in the fact that some supersystems are governed on the basis of self-governance. Directly governing impact from above can be supplemented to this self-governance, and indirect governance, by means of self-governance of other objects, and exerting a direct governing impact on them, can be supplemented here. It is just that the world is one and holistic, and the process of almightiness is also holistic, but the delimitation of creation into these or those objects, this is the peculiarities of perception by man in this case. Although, of course, there are also objective grounds for delimiting creation into these or those objects, or these or those pluralities of objects. I spoke about this last time when I presented creation as a supersystem. If we turn to the history of humanity, considering it as a supersystem, then each culturally peculiar society is a region of the supersystem that entered into a mode of autonomous governance. If we talk about the history of each of the peoples, culturally peculiar societies, then they all differ one from the other in how the entire function of governance is implemented in relation to each of them.
Пока этого нет, историческая наука
And here we run into the main problem
обречена
of
быть
historical
отчасти
science.
шарлатанством. Это не значит, что
You
она
see,
полностью
historians for the
вне
most part are governarily illiterate.
которые придают
Therefore,
заведомо
even
неверное
seeing these or those
представление об
historical
историческом
facts,
процессе.
they, in the overwhelming majority of cases,
Но
are not able to see behind
много
these facts
чего
the
историки
processes of governance and self-governance of social
делают.
systems.
Но
And
тем
even
не
more
менее,
so,
процессы в
the
автономных
processes
и
of
древних
governance of
суперсистемах,
biospheric
они
social
очень
economic
разные,
systems.
потому что если регион выходит
Therefore,
на
the main task of
самоуправление
historical
по
science
полной
is, after all,
функции,
to
то
cultivate in
становится
oneself
помехой для тех,
governorial
кто
literacy
хочет
in order to cease to
восстановить
be
управление
registrars of facts
суперсистемой как
and, in
единым
some
целым
cases,
и
registrars of
хотят
fictions
препятствовать
elevated to the
его
role of
развитию.
reliable scientific facts, but that they would after all see
Соответственно,
the global historical process
возникает
as a particular
вопрос
process
об
in the global
устойчивости
biospheric
управления
process,
по полной функции
and that
при
in the global
претерпевании
historical
в
process
регионах суперсистемы. Потому
they
что
would see the historical
управление по
processes
полной
of each of the
функции
culturally peculiar
это
societies
помеха
and regional
тем, кто
civilizations that exist on planet
приказал
Earth.
объединить суперсистему
Until
снова в
this
единое
happens,
целое,
historical science is
препятствуя
doomed to be
развитию.
partly charlatanism.
И дальше
This does not mean
возникает
that it is
вопрос
absolutely
о
absurd, although there are some historians who give an inherently
взаимодействии
absurd view of history as a process.
регионов друг с другом, характере этого взаимодействия и перспективах. В общем, с точки
But there are
зрения
many
тех, кто
things that
препятствует
historians do
развитию,
not finish
надо
or do
понимать
wrong.
управление по полной функции, как я уже говорил. Но
But,
управление по полной
nevertheless,
функции,
the
оно
processes in the autonomous
тоже
regions
может
of the
быть
supersystem
организовано в
are
регионах
also
по-разному.
different. Because if
Может
the
сложиться
region
центр
comes to
управления,
self-governance
который
according to the entire function,
обеспечивает
then it
управление
becomes an
регионом
obstacle
со
for those who
суперсистемой
want
по
to
полной
restore
функции.
governance towards the supersystem
Дальше
as a
возникает
whole,
вопрос о
but
характере
on the
этого
way, preventing
управления.
it from
То есть
development.
ориентировано оно на развитие региона или оно идентично управлению,
Accordingly,
которое
the question
осуществляется
arises
теми, кто
about the
управляет
stability
этим
of governance according to the entire function of
Если оно
governance on the
идентично
paths of
по
development
целям,
in the regions of the supersystem. Because the entire function of governance in them,
управлению
this is an obstacle to those who are
препятствующих
trying to
развитию,
unite the
то оно обречено на
supersystem
поражение.
again into a single whole,
Почему? Потому что
hindering development.
если вы препятствуете развитию, а кто-то в этом деле преуспел раньше и собрал под собой большие ресурсы, то он вас раздавит.
And further, the question arises about the
Разница есть в
interaction
чем?
of the regions with each other,
Те, кто
the
препятствует
character of this
развитию в
interaction,
масштабах
and
суперсистемы в
prospects.
целом, они, в общем,
From the point of view
претендуют
of
на
those who
контроль
hinder development,
над
it is
суперсистемой.
necessary to suppress
Тех,
the
кто
governance according to the
препятствует
entire
развитию в
function,
пределах
as I have already
регионов
said.
суперсистемы,
But governance
они
according to
могут
the
еще не
entire function
догадываться о том,
can
что
also be organized in the
контроль над
regions in
суперсистемой
different
в
ways.
целом.
A center of
В этом
governance
случае,
can take shape,
поскольку
which provides governance
рацион
towards the region of the
управления
supersystem
и
according to the entire
их
function.
конкурентов имеет довольно высокую глубину идентичности, то они не в
Further, the
состоянии в
question
большинстве
arises
случаев
about the character of this governance.
противодействовать
That
агрессии
is,
против
is it
этого
oriented
региона
towards the development
по
of the
той простой
region,
причине, что агрессия
or
может
is it
проходить
identical
на
to the
уровне,
governance that is carried
который
out
с
by
точки
those who hinder
зрения
development?
не обладают высокой приоритетностью и представляют собой что-то малозначимое. Но, тем не менее, это
So,
может
if it is
оказать
identical in
решающее
terms of
воздействие на
objectives
то,
of
что
governance that hinder
регион
development,
утратит способность
then it is
управления
doomed
по
to
полной
failure.
функции.
Why?
И даже если
Because
вы
if you hinder
сохраните
development
свою
and someone
автономию,
succeeded in this endeavor
функционального
earlier
арифметического
and gathered
обеспечения,
under him more
который будет
resources,
отличным от других,
then he
и
will crush
обладая
you.
способностью к управлению по полной функции, он будет зависим от
What
тех,
is the
кто может
difference?
это обеспечить. Но
Those who
центр
hinder
находится,
development on the
который
scale of the
пытается
supersystem as a
развить
whole,
с целью
they aspire to control the
восстановления
supersystem as a
управления
whole,
в масштабах
and those who
суперсистемы
hinder the
центров,
development of the supersystem
то в
within the
этом
boundaries of the
случае
region,
будет
they may
оказывать
not yet realize that control
воздействие
over the
на
supersystem as a whole is
регионов,
necessary.
неспособных либо утративших управление
And,
по
in
полной
this
функции,
case,
оказывая
since their vector of
своего
objectives of
рода
governance
управленческие
and the vector
влияния,
of their competitors
что может
have a quite high
восприниматься
depth of identity,
отчасти как
then they are not
благо,
able in the
поскольку
majority of cases to
но
counteract aggression
соответствующие
against this region for the
условия
simple reason that
влияния они
aggression
будут
can take place
достаточно
at levels
снижены.
that, from their point of view,
В
do not
общем-то,
have a
здесь
high priority
главная мудрость,
and
кроме
represent something
хуже
of little
конфликта с
significance.
англосаксами, может быть только дружба с англосаксами.
But,
Это
nonetheless,
как раз про это вот.
this can have a decisive impact on the fact
В период
that the
правления
region will
Николая
lose
II
the
мы
ability to
убедились в
govern
том,
according to
что
the
так
entire
по
function.
итогам этого правления в 1917
And even if it
году
retains its autonomy
монархия
in the
рухнула,
aspect of informational algorithmic support,
одна
it
из
will be
целей
different from
была
others.
достигнута.
Then, not possessing the ability to govern according to the entire function, it will be dependent on those that can provide it.
Что
But the
дальше?
center leader that
Дальше
hinders
понимаете,
development with the
получается
objective
так,
of
что
restoration
развитие
of the unity
автономии
of governance on
региона,
the scale
оно
of the
может
supersystem as a whole,
именно
in
в
this case
режиме
will have an
автономности,
impact on
автархии,
each of these regions that
взаимодействия
are
с
incapable
другими
or have
регионами
lost governance
суперсистемы.
according to the entire
Но
function,
если
providing
развитие
them with sui
протекает, то в
generis
основе его
governorial
целевого
services,
управления по
which
полной
can be
функции,
partly perceived as
дальше
blago,
встает
since there are
вопрос
services.
о том, как
But the phenomena
противостоять
accompanying these
стремлению
services will be
ликвидировать
quite
это
severe.
управление по полной функции. Ответ будет
So, as
простым.
folk wisdom goes, worse than conflict with the Anglo-Saxons can only be friendship with the Anglo-Saxons. This is precisely about this.
Концепция управления по полной функции регионом
During the
суперсистемы
reign of Nikolai II, we became convinced that this was so, based on the results of the reign of 1917, because when the monarchy collapsed, the phrase sounded in the British Parliament, "One of the objectives of the war has been accomplished."
Да, безусловно, это конфликт управлений в пределах суперсистемы.
What further?
Но дальше возникает
And further,
еще
you see,
один
it turns
вопрос.
out
А как
that the
организовано
development of an
управление
autonomous
по
region
полной
can
функции
proceed
в
precisely in the
пределах
mode of
самой
autonomy,
суперсистемы?
autarky, a minimum of interaction with
Тут
other
тоже
regions of the
получается,
supersystem.
оно может быть организовано двояко. Может
But
быть
if development
управление, то
proceeds,
есть некое
then it's
множество
anyway
мелких
based on
суперсистем,
governance according to the
которые
entire
занимаются
function,
тем,
and further the
что
question
вырабатывают
arises
концепцию
as to how
управления
to
по полной
resist the
функции
striving to
и
liquidate this
обеспечивают
governance
управление
according to the entire
суперсистемой
function.
по ней в соответствии с этой концепцией. Все прочие
The answer is
не
simple.
подлежащие, не
First,
входящие в этот центр,
you anyway have to
заняты
think
каким-то
about the development of the
деянием
supersystem as a
функций,
whole. This
и все
means that the
протекает
conception of
по
governance
отношению
according to the entire function
их
towards the region of the
самоуправления
supersystem
протекает в русле
should go beyond the boundaries of this
иерархически
region,
высшего
and it
по
should
отношению
encompass
к
the
каждому из
supersystem
них
as a whole. That
управления
is,
уровня
tasks and objectives
управления
should be set at the level of the
суперсистемой.
supersystem as a whole.
Это один вариант управления. Этот вариант управления, он в общем
Yes, of course, it is a conflict of
плох,
governance within the
потому
supersystem.
что центр управления
But then
разный.
another question arises.
Его можно вычислить, его можно
How is the
уничтожить.
governance according to the
В
entire
конечном
function
итоге
organized
он может
within the
быть
boundaries of this very
потеряв
supersystem
устойчивость
in the autonomous
управления,
region?
перейти на
Here, too, it
концепцию
turns out that it can be organized in a twofold way. There can be a center of governance, that is, a certain plurality of elements of the supersystem, which are engaged in working out a conception of governance according to the entire function, and providing governance towards the supersystem in accordance with the entire function and in accordance with this conception. All other elements, they do not belong to and are not included into this center. They are engaged in some other things, other functions. And everything proceeds in relation to them in such a way that their self-governance flows in the stream of a hierarchically higher in relation to each of them, governance of the level of this region of the supersystem. This is one variant of governance. This variant of governance is bad. Why? Because the center of governance is vulnerable. It can be exposed, it can be destroyed. Ultimately, it may, having lost the stability of governance, switch to the conception of a competitor and an aggressor. On this theme, Kozma Prudkov has a phrase: "The Egyptians at one time were a just and loved people." In other words, in its time, Egypt was governed differently. Egypt was governed according to the conception of development. But when they ceased to be a just and loved people, there appeared the biblical project of buying up the world on the basis of usury, restoring the integrity of governance towards the supersystem humanity as a whole, through the path of suppressing processes of development in all regions. V.O. Kluchevsky has another phrase that characterizes Russia. In Russia, the center is on the periphery. What stands behind this phrase? Behind it, there stands the fact that in Russia, a quite large number of the population, at critical moments in the history of Russia, began to show autocracy, people's power. They took responsibility for the country as a whole, for civilization as a whole, showed the appropriate initiative, although no one authorized them to do this. Factually, in this mode, the center of governance exists as a virtual structure. On the one hand, it exists, and on the other hand, it is rather problematic to detect it. And the detection of even active elements does not allow one to be convinced in the fact that there is still no certain number of sleeper elements that are ready to act in the event of a failure of active elements. This system of governance turns out to be more effective than the system of governance with a single center. And this circumstance was reflected in the first version of the sufficiently general theory of governance and in the subsequent ones, because the second variant was characterized as block governance, and the first variant was characterized as an interregional conglomerate, in which there is a certain center of governance, and this center of governance prevents the regions of the supersystem from being governed according to the entire function. But as I have already noted before, if the task for the sake of which the supersystem was introduced into the environment is the task of mastering the potential of development, then the interregional conglomerate and its center of governance exists within the boundaries of allowance, that is, until the certain time, or until the era of their activity exceeds the acceptable from the point of view of the hierarchically highest all-encompassing governance boundaries. Well, as for block-type governance, the basic principle is that the center is on the periphery. The center is wandering. The center is relevant according to the problems and tasks that are being solved. There is a dynamic redistribution of functions and obligations depending on the situation, tendencies in the development of the situation. And this, in principle, provides a higher quality of governance and higher reliability of governance, a higher level of protection of governance from unauthorized intrusion, especially aggression. If we analyze the interaction of the block and the conglomerate, then it turns out that the regions of the conglomerate need their governance to be carried out according to the entire function. Two centers can offer services of this kind: the block and the center of governance towards the conglomerate. The only difference is in the character of the implementation of the entire function, because block governance presupposes the mastery of the potential of development, and accordingly, reliance on the objective laws to which the supersystem as a whole and each of its regions are subordinated. And this circumstance leads to the emergence of the identity of governance in different regions of the supersystem. The identity of governance in the future should lead to the fact that the dependence of the supersystem as a whole on the long-range action and performance speed of the information exchange channels between distant fragments of the supersystem is lost. Why? For the simple reason that there is no need to wait for a command from the center in order for the supersystem to react as it should. The supersystem will react as it should on the basis of autonomous governances, which, by strength of the action of objective laws, will work out identical governorial decisions in relation to the emerging problems of development. Well, and accordingly, if the potential of development of the supersystem is mastered, then the integrity of governance of the supersystem is restored, but in a different quality, a quality which ensures the self-governance of the supersystem on the basis of virtual structures that take shape in it. And the supersystem again returns to the two-level method of organizing the supersystem as a whole and an element of the supersystem. In relation to human society, such a mode of self-governance in the Russian language is called subordinist. Subordinist is when everyone acts in a volitional order at his own discretion, and his will supports the will of other people without being an obstacle for anyone. The basis for this is the dictatorship of Soviet. So, that's it for now. Thank you for your attention. All the best. Until the next time.